Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that rises from the golden sands of Phoenicia, crosses the relentless waves of the Mediterranean, and finds its destiny in the heart of Greece. This is the saga of a lost princess, Europa, and her brother Cadmos, a prince who set out to find his sister, but instead discovered his own fate. It is a tale of a sacred cow guided by the gods, a fierce battle with a celestial dragon of Ares, and a city born from the very teeth of a monster sown into the earth. You will witness the founding of seven-gated Thebes, a wedding where the gods themselves descended from Olympus to sit among mortals, and the ultimate transformation of a hero into the very creature he once conquered. A story where the gift of the alphabet meets the weight of a divine curse, leading from a king's palace to the eternal peace of the Elysian fields. Disclaimer: the visuals in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed for cinematic and emotional depth. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please keep this in mind before watching. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you, wishing you a peaceful sleep. The Epic of Kadmos and Europa, a civilizational journey from Phoenicia to Thebes, begins now. On the eastern Mediterranean shores, woven with legends drifting from the dusty pages of ancient times, in those primordial ages when the sun rose every morning from the sea like a heap of glowing embers, the pearl of Phoenicia, Tyre, the city of Sur, rose like the earthly shadow of splendor and nobility, where waves struck the coast in silver arcs. In this magnificent city, surrounded by high walls and fragrant with myrrh, time itself seemed to flow with dignity. At the heart of the city, in that legendary palace known for its massive columns reaching toward the sky and built of marbles brought from distant lands, there resided King Agenor, a ruler whose roots reached back to the gods and the ancient kings. Agenor's lineage was sealed not only with the land, but also with the mystery of the deep waters. He had carried a divine legacy born from the union of Poseidon, the fierce and mighty lord of the seas, and mysterious Libya herself. This sacred blood had made Agenor not only the most powerful king of Phoenicia, but also a reflection of the gods upon the earth. Yet his heritage had not been limited to Poseidon alone. Flowing in his veins was also the noble blood of Io, whom Zeus had once loved and who, to escape the wrath of jealous Hera, had crossed continents disguised as a silver heifer, traveling as far as the fertile lands of the Nile. Agenor had borne the weight of this immense past on his shoulders like a badge of honor, turning his kingdom into a cradle of justice and wealth. At his side stood Queen Telephassa, whose grace enchanted not only the people of the palace, but the entire realm, and who formed the unshakable foundation of this noble dynasty. Life for Agenor and Telephassa in Tyre had unfolded amid abundance adorned with the rarest spices of the Mediterranean, the deepest purple dyes, and the finest woven fabrics. Yet the true jewel of the palace had been neither the gold ingots in the treasury nor the ivory inlaid thrones. The palace's true shining star had been Europa, Agenor's cherished daughter, whose beauty stirred the hearts of mortals and drew even the immortal gods on the cloud-wrapped peaks of Olympus to look down with deep curiosity and desire. Even as Europa had begun to bloom in the earliest buds of youth, whenever she appeared in Tyre's sunlit squares or on the palace's high balconies overlooking the sea, people had held their breath and whispered to one another whether she might have been a goddess. Her beauty had been as fresh as the unique pink glow left on the horizon at dawn, and as clear as the still waters of the Mediterranean at its deepest and calmest point. Her hair had gathered the golden brilliance of Phoenicia's blazing sun as if in a net, cascading from her shoulders like a stream of light. Her eyes had reflected the purest, most untouched blue of the seas guarded by Poseidon, her father's great ancestor. Agenor had felt pride every second in his daughter's otherworldly beauty, yet deep within he had feared that such radiance might draw the envy of the gods. For this reason, he had raised Europa like a priceless treasure, sheltered within the palace's high walls and impenetrable rings of guards protected from the dust and evils of the outside world. Europa, however, had not been a bird trapped in a golden cage. She had possessed a free spirit like the salt-scented winds blowing along Phoenicia's shores. Palace life had served not only as a refuge for her, but also as a field of discovery. Her days had passed weaving the most delicate patterns amid the rhythmic clatter of looms, joking with her attendants in cool marble halls, polished with myrrh oil and lavender flowers, and listening to hymns composed in her honor by palace poets and sung to the accompaniment of the lyre. Grace had been hidden in every step, and nobility had rested in every glance. The most important figures reminding everyone in Agenor's palace that Europa had not been alone, and that her beauty had been constantly protected, had been her brothers, who would one day carve their names into history in golden letters through their heroism and loyalty. Cadmos, the eldest son of the noble dynasty, known for his dignity and intellect, had stood as a living symbol of brotherly bonds and protection. At his side stood the ambitious and brave Phoenix and the determined and resilient Cilix, all sources of pride for Agenor. These three princes had formed around their sister Europa an unbreakable living shield that no force in the world could overcome. Although poets from distant lands and certain ancient traditions had sometimes spoken of Europa as the daughter of Phoenix, within the marble walls of Tyre's palace and in the hearts of its people, the prevailing belief had been unshakable. She had been Agenor's most precious legacy and Teliphasa's most beloved daughter. Under their father's supervision, these noble brothers had not learned only how to wield the sword and master the arts of war. They had also been initiated into the secrets of those mysterious signs and letters, writing itself, that Phoenicia would one day gift to the world, turning sounds into symbols and thoughts into lasting marks. Kadmos, with his sharp intellect and immense physical strength, had stepped ahead of his brothers, being raised as King Agenor's greatest support in governance and as Tyre's future ruler and protector of its people. For Kadmos, Europa had been not merely a sister to be protected, but the earthly embodiment of his family's honor and light. The oath of brotherhood had been the most sacred and untouchable custom of this dynasty. Kadmos, Phoenix, and Cilix had sworn before the gods time and again since childhood that they would place their sister Europa's safety and happiness above their own lives, ambitions, and even their futures. Whenever Europa had wandered through the palace gardens adorned with fragrant jasmines, or played games with her friends on Tyre's flowered hillsides with baskets in their hands, one of her brothers had always followed her like a shadow, unseen yet ever present. They had never allowed a single shadow to fall upon this shining star, nor a single foreign gaze to disturb her peace. Queen Telephassa had watched this unbreakable, almost steel-woven bond among her children with tenderness, often reminding them how exalted their lineage was and how heavy their responsibilities were. They had been the rightful heirs of Poseidon's boundless power that crossed the seas and of the life-giving fertile waters of the Nile. This noble origin had been sealed with the aristocratic blood flowing through each of their veins, carrying within it a divine spark. The palace of Tyre had seemed like a unique sanctuary on earth, where divine heritage and superhuman beauty converged. This family portrait, the pride of Agenor, had appeared as though it would never be shaken during those peaceful and sunlit days of Tyre. As Europa watched the foaming sea from the palace's high terraces and imagined what lay beyond the distant horizons, her father Agenor and her brothers planned alliances with the strongest kings and noblest dynasties of the Mediterranean for her future, dreaming of founding cities in her name. The city shone as a cradle of civilization, where the first seeds of the Phoenician alphabet sprouted in mines, and where trade blended with wealth and wisdom with art. Yet this calm sea and peaceful air had begun to fall under threat from the gaze of a god seated on a cloud-born throne at the highest level of the sky, one who could never remain indifferent to mortal beauty, especially to such a rare radiance. When Zeus, the king of the gods, had looked down from his golden throne upon this fertile corner of the earth, he had noticed the young girl laughing and gathering flowers with her attendants along the shores of Tyre. Europa's every movement and every smile had stirred storms within Zeus's mind, and the god had fallen in love at first sight with her divine beauty and nobility. Europa herself, however, had remained completely unaware that she stood at the center of a divine game, of a tragic yet magnificent transformation. Under her brother's unbreakable protection and her father's gentle care, she had continued to shine as Phoenicia's brightest star and to enjoy life. Kadmos and his brothers had greeted each day in the palace with festive joy. At great tables set for evening meals, their sister's cheerful laughter had warmed Tyre's cold marble corridors and brought a smile to their father Agenor's weary face. The family's noble origins had been proudly recalled to the people at every formal ceremony, every sacrificial rite, and every celebration. Poets had endlessly told how Agenor's lineage, empowered by Poseidon, had ruled the seas and tamed the winds. This noble beginning had already borne the first fruits of that unbreakable brotherhood which would one day form the foundation of great storms, continent-spanning exiles, and immense cities built from nothing during this golden age of Tyre. Europa's radiance had begun here, in her father's home, like the opening lines of a vast epic that would illuminate not only Phoenician lands, but the entire ancient world, from east to west along every shore. These had been the happiest, most carefree, and most peaceful days of a noble family bound together around this shining star, before each member set out toward a difficult fate of their own, toward battling their own monster, or founding their own city. Each morning, as Cadmos strapped on his sword, he looked at his sister and believed with all his heart that he would remain faithful to that sacred brotherhood oath and protect her at any cost. King Agenor, meanwhile, had sat proudly and peacefully on his throne, never imagining that one day his daughter's beauty would travel far beyond the borders of his kingdom, cross the seas, give its name forever to a new continent, and scatter his children across the earth. Thus, this splendid and fairy tale life that began in the Phoenician city of Tyre had laid the groundwork, both for the birth of a great civilization and for one of the greatest stories of love, pursuit, and tragedy in human history. Europa, as the sole honor and focus of love within the dynasty, had unknowingly illuminated not only her father's palace, but also the unknown, dangerous, yet profoundly divine future that awaited her. Her brothers, ever vigilant so that this star would not fade and this light would not be lost, had stood by her side like solid rock, with a will as firm as Tyre's unshakable walls. Yet neither their divine lineage, nor the blood of Poseidon, nor the unbreakable oaths they had sworn to one another would prove sufficient to stop the relentless desire of a god and the irreversible turning of fate's wheels. Phoenicia's bright star would soon slip away from her homeland and her father's house like a shooting star, leaving behind deep traces of centuries-long searches, bloody wars, and the birth of an entirely new civilization. On the sun-washed golden sands of the Phoenician coast, in the shadow of the mighty walls of the city of Tyre, Europa woke to one of the most peaceful and serene mornings of her life, completely unaware of how sharply her fate was about to turn that day. On the highest level of the sky, seated upon the golden throne of Olympus beyond the clouds, Zeus watched the world of mortals at every moment with the sharp gaze of an eagle, and for some time he had been bound by a great, uncontrollable passion to this daughter of Agenor, the king of Phoenicia, whose beauty was unmatched. Europa was not merely a princess. She was an earthly miracle, whose grace even the gods could not ignore. When Zeus saw her pure innocence and untouched beauty, he could not quell the immense desire that awakened in his heart. No matter the cost, he resolved to possess her and to make her a part of his divine world. However, the Lord of the heavens knew very well that if he appeared before this tender young girl in all his divine splendor, with his thunderbolts and booming voice, he would frighten her and drive her away. Therefore, using his divine intellect, he decided to devise a cunning game. Setting aside his majesty, he chose the most innocent and enchanting guise in which to descend to the earth. That morning, Europa woke with her usual joy and took with her the most distinguished attendants of the palace of Tyre, as well as her loyal companions who had never left her side since childhood, and she went down to the flower-filled meadows by the shore. Her brothers Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix initially joined this cheerful group, and as their father Agenor had instructed, undertook the duty of protecting their sister with their customary seriousness. However, the captivating awakening of nature, the colorful butterflies dancing in the air, and the dizzying scents brought by spring were enough to distract the young princes. As the legends related, Europa asked her brothers for permission for a moment and agreed that they could wander more freely while she gathered flowers. When the princes began, one by one, to chase those bright-winged butterflies toward the far corners of the meadow and the edge of the forest, the most secluded and most beautiful part of the shore remained only to Europa and her young attendants. The young women joyfully gathered violets, lilies, and bright red poppies that had stolen the color of the sun, and they celebrated the arrival of spring with songs as they placed these wonders of nature in one another's hair. At precisely those moments of innocence, a being that had quietly mingled among the other cattle grazing slowly across the kingdom's wide meadows began to approach them with slow, dignified steps. This was Zeus himself, yet his appearance at that moment was that of a white bull so enchanting that no eye could turn away, far removed from any divine terror or savagery. In the accounts of the ancient poets, the description of this bull resembled a work of art, like a living statue. Its color was as pure as the snows on mountain peaks untouched by human feet, or as fresh ice that had not yet melted under the warm southern wind. Its neck was adorned with muscles symbolizing unshakable strength, yet the dewlaps hanging from its shoulders gave it not a frightening grandeur, but rather an unusual gentleness. Most striking of all were its horns, small yet priceless like jewels, translucent and flawless, as if shaped by the hand of a master sculptor. There was not the slightest sign of threat upon its brow. Its eyes reflected a deep peace, intelligence, and calm, far removed from any animal ferocity. When Europa saw this magnificent creature separate itself from the herd and come directly toward her, as if it were seeking only her, she first flinched slightly. Yet in the face of the unusual serenity and reassuring presence emanating from the bull, her fear quickly gave way to great admiration and curiosity. The bull stood before the princess with such gentleness and such profound dignity that Europa began to think it was not merely an ordinary animal, but rather a magical being, trying to communicate with her in a wordless language. With trembling fingers, she began to stroke the bull's white fur, soft as silk, and to offer some of the freshest flowers in her hand to its white, gentle mouth, as if presenting an offering. Zeus, though in the guise of an animal, was almost intoxicated by these delicate touches from Europa's slender hands, and he patiently awaited the final stage of his plan, the great moment of victory growing within him. He gently licked her hands and tried to win her complete trust by making playful, graceful leaps around her. Encouraged by the admiring words of the attendants around her, Europa drew even closer to the bull and began to hang the colorful crowns and fragrant garlands she had woven from the finest wildflowers upon its bright, translucent horns like ornaments. The bull was so docile, so obedient, that in the end it crouched down before Europa, as if kneeling, clearly inviting her onto its back. The young princess thought this would be a wonderful game she would tell all her life, and that by galloping from one end of the meadow to the other on this magnificent animal, she could astonish her brothers watching from afar. Amid the looks of surprise and envy from her friends, completely unaware of whose back she was mounting, and to what divine will she was surrendering herself, she gently sat upon the bull. When she took the flower chains she had hung around its neck into her hands like reins and began an imaginary riding game, the bull slowly and smoothly rose to its feet. At first, everything appeared like an innocent palace game. The white bull moved calmly and solemnly across the meadows, while Europa waved cheerfully to her friends left behind, delighting in the childlike pleasure of riding upon its back. However, as the bull's steps left the green meadows and approached the shore and the foaming waters, its pace quickened and the nature of the game suddenly changed. When it took its first step into the shallow waters of the beach, Europa still thought this was a playful joke and that the bull would soon return to land. Yet when the bull, without a moment's hesitation, plunged toward the deep waters, as if walking upon the sea itself, and began to race away at an unbelievable speed among the massive waves, the princess's joyful laughter gave way to cries filled with terror that tore at the heart. Her brother Cadmus noticed this incredible sight from a distant part of the shore and ran toward the beach, shouting until his throat felt torn. But it was in vain. The white bull had already reached the open sea and the line of the horizon, cutting through the waves like the prow of a ship. Europa clung desperately to the bull's shining horns, bracing herself with one hand against its powerful back, while trying with the other to control her garments whipping wildly in the wind. When she turned back with tear-filled eyes, she watched the Phoenician shores where she had been born and raised, her father's magnificent palace, and the shrinking silhouettes of her brothers running helplessly along the coast. Her heart filled with a deep fear and an unhealable longing born of being torn away from the warm home in which she had taken refuge. Yet this was not an ordinary abduction or a commonplace journey. According to the descriptions of ancient texts, as Zeus, in the form of a bull, crossed the salty waters of the Mediterranean like a ruler, all the creatures beneath the sea and even the sea gods themselves understood that this abduction was driven by a higher, divine will, and they opened the way and calmed the raging waves. In the very middle of the boundless blue, Europa traveled toward her destiny, surrendering to the wind that billowed her clothes and to the sea salt washing her face, without knowing to what unknown land this mysterious animal was carrying her. This journey, during which silvery glimmers danced upon the water, continued for hours in which the sense of time was lost. At last, in the middle of the vast sea, a massive island containing every shade of green began to appear. This was the sacred island of Crete, Zeus's homeland where his childhood had passed. When the bull reached the island's rugged yet beautiful shores, it gently set Europa down upon the ground, as if she were a delicate flower he cherished. The game had ended, and divine reality revealed itself in all its searing splendor. When Zeus shed the enchanting guise of the white bull and assumed his true, divine, and majestic form, Europa understood with terror and awe that the being before her was not an ordinary creature, but the Lord of the universe and of all the gods. On those sacred lands of Crete, in the coolness of the Dictaean plain or beneath the famous plane tree at Gortyn that never shed its leaves, Europa was no longer the lost princess of Phoenicia, but was preparing to become the first queen of Crete and the mother of a new lineage. As an eternal token of his love for Europa and of the value he placed upon her, Zeus presented her with a unique golden necklace forged by the smith god Hephaestus. Not content with this, he gave her and her new homeland 3 great miraculous gifts to protect them from every danger. The gigantic bronze giant Talos, who circled the island 3 times a day to guard it, the legendary dog Laelaps, who never let any prey escape, and a magical javelin that never missed its target once thrown. From this divine union, 3 noble sons were born who would become the subjects of history's greatest legends, labyrinths and judgments, Minos, Sarpedon, and Rhadamanthes. Although Europa was torn from her homeland by this immense game devised by a god, she ultimately laid the foundations of the great civilization that would give its name to an entire continent upon the fertile soil of Crete. The shining star of Phoenicia had transformed into a wise queen ruling over the waters of the Aegean, leaving behind the great and hopeless quest in which her brothers, especially Cadmus, would search the world for years. Zeus, in order to immortalize this magnificent abduction and the love he had experienced, created the constellation of Taurus upon the dark atlas of the sky, engraving forever among the stars the memory of that white bull and that miraculous day. The shores of Phoenicia, beaten by silver waves and once stirred with joy, sank into a deep, heavy, almost suffocating silence after that ominous morning. The cheerful laughter that had echoed among the sky-defying marble columns of the Palace of Tyre gave way to the dark corridors of a murmuring mourning. King Agenor's palace, which only days earlier had shone like a sun with the beauty of Europa, the brightest jewel of the Mediterranean, now trembled with the destructive fury of a father who had lost his child and shaken an entire kingdom. Zeus had taken on the form of a magnificent and gentle white bull and had abducted Europa across the foaming waves to Crete, leaving behind only sorrowful memories and flower garlands scattered on the wet sand of the shore, already beginning to fade. After that terrifying moment when Europa vanished into the deep blue waters, time seemed to stop for the people of Tyre and the royal family, and the entire city froze in this great tragedy. Agenor, the proud and powerful ruler descended from Poseidon and Libya, could not accept his daughter's absence. The fierce divine blood flowing in his veins turned the helplessness within him into a burning anger that consumed everything around him. The High Council gathered in the king's palace witnessed Agenor sitting on his ivory throne with a rage never seen before, a fury that chilled the blood. When the king summoned his sons Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, who had been entrusted with protecting and watching over his most precious possession, his daughter Europa, the massive bronze gates of Tyre closed with a heavy, creaking and frightening sound, as if they had announced a disaster. Agenor's eyes were blinded by the pain of his lost daughter and by the sense of humiliation that came with that loss. This indescribable suffering made him at once a devout father and a ruthless, merciless judge. This complex state of mind, described by the ancient poet Ovid in his immortal lines as facto pius et sceleratus eodem, that is, both devout and sinful in the same act, was the clearest summary of the attitude Agenor would take toward his own children. With a trembling voice that lost none of its authority, the king offered his sons only one choice. Either they would find their sister Europa and bring her safely back within the walls of Tyre, or they would never again set foot in their father's house on these sacred lands. This was not so much an order as the formal declaration of an endless exile with no clear end, perhaps even one that led to death. Agenor's fury was so great that he took out on his innocent sons the resentment of a mortal man who had failed to see the cunning games of Zeus, the invincible ruler of the sky. For the princes, who were bound tightly to one another by an oath of brotherhood, this moment marked the greatest and most painful breaking point of their lives. Cadmus, the eldest brother, heard in his father's harsh command not only the authority of a king, but also the final cry of a man whose soul had been shattered and broken apart. Together with his brothers Phoenix and Cilix, Cadmus had searched the sands and rocks of the shore since that dark day for any trace of Europa, yet they had remained completely helpless in trying to find the traces of a divine being lost in the depths of the sea and on the wings of the wind. In that famous and somber assembly at Agenor's palace, the words that fell from the king's lips like a curse, "Do not return without finding her," meant a break not only from Tyre, but from an entire past, from childhood and from identity. Agenor saw his daughter's abduction as a stain on honor and a divine humiliation, and he condemned his sons to an unknown fate in order to cleanse that stain. The wealthy harbors of Tyre, once overflowing with goods from all corners of the world and echoing with the joyful sounds of merchant ships, now groaned with the preparations of mourning vessels, bearing witness to the dramatic breaking apart of a family. The beginning of the search journey became one of the most sorrowful and yet most magnificent expeditions in Phoenician history. As Cadmus set out either to escape his father's destructive wrath or to fulfill his seemingly impossible command, he did not travel only with his loyal men and warriors. Queen Telephassa also joined this uncertain and dangerous journey, refusing to leave her son's side even for a moment. As a mother, Telephassa carried the pain of her lost daughter deep in her heart, while also sharing in the uncertain fate of her exiled, displaced son. The ships that weighed anchor from the harbor of Tyre sailed with the wind at their backs, not only to search for Europa, but also to carry the cultural seeds, the writings, and the knowledge of Phoenician civilization to distant lands. As Cadmus and his mother Telephassa began a directionless search across the vast, sometimes violent and sometimes treacherous blue of the Mediterranean, the walls of Tyre they left behind slowly shrank on the horizon and disappeared from sight. This departure marked for Cadmus not only the loss of a homeland, but also the first step taken toward the great heroic trial that would one day make him the legendary founder of the city of Thebes. The first stages of the journey were filled with endless despair and suffocating waves of grief. After leaving behind the warmth of the Phoenician coast, Cadmus and Telephassa asked for traces of Europa in every port they visited, on every island they set foot on, and from every stranger they encountered. Yet the answer they received was always a deep silence. The other brothers, Phoenix and Cilix, also bowed to their father's command and scattered in different directions. Phoenix decided to remain in the lands that would forever bear his name, while Cilix turned north, settled in the region of Cilicia, and built his own kingdom there. Cadmus, however, driven by his unshakable determination to find his sister and by his mother Telephassa's tireless encouragement, chose to press farther north toward the violent and misty waters of the Aegean. Ancient sources stated that during this journey, Cadmus faced every kind of immense danger, monster, and storm. Yet he gradually came to understand through bitter experience how impossible it was to track a mortal abducted by Zeus himself. The relentless storms they encountered along the way and the gnawing uncertainty in their minds seemed like distant reflections of the cold fury that Agenor unleashed in his palace at Tyre. The arduous path of Cadmus and his mother Telephassa eventually brought them to the harsh and wild shores of Thrace. The long months and exhausting years they spent there passed with the hope that each rising sun might bring the smallest news of Europa, yet each sunset carried disappointment with it. The bone-chilling winds of Thrace and its untamed, unyielding nature formed a land that was extremely difficult to endure for the queen and the young prince, who had been accustomed to the sunny, silken, marble-scented palace life of Phoenicia. Still, Cadmus never gave up, supported by his mother's wise guidance. According to some ancient traditions, during this forced pause, Cadmus did not act only as a desperate seeker, but also as a bearer of civilization. He planted the first seeds of the Phoenician alphabet and its deep store of knowledge in these foreign lands. Yet the command of his father Agenor still pressed coldly against the back of his neck like a sharp blade. Do not return without finding her. This relentless order was like a divine whip that tore Cadmus away from Tyre forever and forced him to seek new homelands and new destinies. Thus King Agenor's momentary anger and unending pain scattered the noblest and brightest family of Phoenicia across the world like grains of dust. As Europa moved forward on Crete toward becoming a queen and shaping a continent, her brothers began to build their own destinies with their bare hands in the foreign and ominous lands of their exile. Cadmus's sorrowful departure from Phoenicia in fact marked the beginning of one of the greatest cultural migrations the ancient world had ever seen. Queen Telephasa's decision to accompany her son on this arduous path whispered that this exile was not only a destructive punishment, but also the herald of an entirely new and magnificent beginning. The tragedy that began one morning on the shores of Tyre would, in Cadmus's hands, turn over time into a vast epic of civilization. Yet in those first days, in the heart of the young prince leaving the harbor, there was only his father's unending anger and a deep, aching longing for his lost sister. As Agenor continued to mourn in the darkness of the palace of Tyre, Kadmos and Telephassa sailed toward the misty unknown of the Aegean, leaving their first indelible marks on one of the greatest stories of search and creation in human history. That harsh, irreversible command, stripped of paternal compassion and echoing through the high-ceilinged halls of King Agenor's palace in Tyre, Sidon, had placed the heaviest and most crushing burden in the world upon the shoulders of Cadmus, the noble prince of Phoenicia. His father, with the authority of a king, had forbidden him to set foot within the palace walls unless he found and brought back his sister Europa, and he had threatened him with eternal exile, being severed from his homeland and his lineage, should he fail to obey this impossible order. This command had hurled Cadmus into the boundless and treacherous waters of the Mediterranean as both a devout son bound to his father and a sinner torn from his land and struck by the wrath of the gods. At his side were not only his loyal men, the most skilled sailors of Phoenicia, but also his mother, Queen Telephassa, whose heart had been shattered into 1,000 pieces by the pain of losing a child. Together, they had embarked on a task that lay far beyond human power, almost impossible in nature, tracking the trail of a mortal who had been cunningly abducted by a god, by Zeus himself, the supreme ruler of the heavens. Years passed swiftly, like seasons chasing one another, and growing colder each time, yet not a single whisper, not a scrap of cloth, nor even the faintest fragment of news about Europa ever reached the ears of these hopeless travelers. Cadmus, together with his mother, had first put in at the sunlit, iodine-scented shores of the island of Rhodes, where he had offered the most precious sacrifices to the ancient gods and asked after his sister's fate. As told in the depths of ancient legends, Cadmus had acted there not only as a seeker, but also as a builder. He had raised a magnificent temple in honor of his great ancestor Poseidon, and had sown upon these lands the mysterious signs that were Phoenicia's greatest gift to the world, the first seeds of the alphabet. Yet neither the glittering shores of Rhodes nor the deep forests of Cyprus, scented with mint and thyme, had been able to return to them the trace of Europa, who had vanished among the foaming waves on the back of a white bull. The sea seemed to have swallowed its secret, and the wind had erased Europa's name from its memory. As Cadmus tried to comfort his mother Telephassa's body, which had grown weary with the passing years, and her spirit, which sank further day by day, he had turned his course northward toward the fierce and mist-laden waters of the Aegean. As the sails filled with wind and the ships cut through the waves, the questions asked in every harbor, every foreign city, and every desolate island had remained unanswered. The great design devised by the gods had continued to be carefully hidden from mortal eyes. Telephassa had abandoned a queen's crown, the silk beds of the palace of Tyre, and all comfort to follow her child. Yet each passing season had weakened her endurance a little more and dusted her hair with snow. As they roamed the world from end to end, almost inch by inch, neither human intellect nor a hero's physical strength had been enough to uncover that divine secret concealed by Zeus. These hopeless and grueling years had hardened Cadmus's character like iron forged in blazing fire, transforming him from Phoenicia's carefree and spoiled prince into a patient, wise hero shaped by suffering. When their journey finally carried them to the island of Samothrace, the dense, tangible divine weight in the island's atmosphere had shaken them deeply. This had not been an ordinary island. It had been the sacred and dark domain of the great gods, the mysteries of the Kabiri. Samothrace's sheer cliffs and mysterious caves had carried the first tones of Cadmus's future fate, whispering to his soul. During the time they spent there, Cadmus had not only searched for his lost sister, but had also formed deep ties with the island's ancient and fearsome cults. Ancient sources whispered that on this sacred ground, Cadmus's path had crossed with legendary figures such as the god-born Dardanus and Iation, and that he might even have encountered for the first time, in the dim light of these mysterious rites, the goddess Harmonia, who would later become the love of his life and his wife. Yet even this sacred stop, despite all prayers and offerings, had not returned Europa to them. Theseus, their nephew, or according to some sources their brother, who had accompanied them and formed an important part of the group, had decided to remain in these foreign and enchanting lands and to carve out his own fate along these rugged shores, and he had separated from the group. As Theseus had colonized the nearby island and given it his own name, this separation had become the first bitter fruit of loneliness and loss for Cadmus and Telephassa. The gradual loss of their companions, the exhaustion of the roads, and the continued absence of Europa had drawn the young prince into a deep, dark melancholy. From that point on, Telephassa had felt that her soul and body could go no farther, and that she had begun to be crushed and worn away under the immense weight of this relentless search. When mother and son finally reached the harsh, wild shores of Thrace, where the wind lashed like a whip, Telephassa's life had come to its end. Beneath Thrace's fierce winds and murmuring forests, the noble queen had breathed her last in her son's arms, still murmuring the name of her lost daughter and searching the distant horizons for the trace of a white bull. For Cadmus, this moment had been etched into the dusty pages of history as the darkest, loneliest, and most hopeless moment of his life. He had buried his mother with great mourning in the cold, stony embrace of a foreign land, on the dusty roads of Thrace, far from the warm Phoenician soil where he had been born and raised. Although he had fulfilled every funeral rite befitting a queen without omission, the tears he shed at her grave had not been only for the loss of a mother, but also for a hope that had ended, a family that had been shattered, and a duty that had gone unfulfilled. With his mother's death, Cadmus had felt with stark clarity, down to his very bones, that he was utterly alone in the vast world, that he could never return to Tyre because he had failed to carry out his father's command, and that he no longer had a home to which he could take refuge. He had no longer been the mighty prince of Phoenicia, nor a determined seeker. He had been a homeless, forsaken, and sorrowful exile, tossed about by the merciless winds of fate. Yet this great and devastating tragedy had also been the harbinger of an entirely new and immense beginning. After fulfilling his final filial duty to his mother, Cadmus had been hosted by the harsh but honest people of Thrace, but the unrelenting restlessness within him and the voice of fate calling him had forced him into motion once again. He had now been compelled to make his own decisions and draw his own path, and he had nothing left in his hands concerning Europa's trail except an empty hope. At this point, realizing that he had reached the end of human effort and stubbornness, he had decided that he now needed divine guidance, a lofty sign. The farewell he had spoken at his mother's modest yet dignified grave in Thrace had in fact been a farewell to his former identity as a Phoenician prince. He had not abandoned the task of finding Europa, but he had entrusted it to the justice of the gods. As for himself, he would seek his own destiny, and perhaps the foundations of an entirely new civilization he would establish. Alone on the wild lands of Thrace, carrying unextinguished pain in his heart and countless questions in his mind, he had decided to set out on a long journey southward, toward Delphi, the voice of wisdom, prophecy, and the god Apollo. This long period of mourning that Cadmus had spent in Thrace had in fact been a process of maturation that had strengthened him enough to become the founder of the legendary city of Thebes and a dragon-slaying hero, and that had tempered his soul into steel. The loss of his mother and the heavy silence from Europa had driven him to surrender his own will to the will of the gods. The dark mysteries of Samothrace and the grueling roads of Thrace had carved deep marks into his soul and had transformed him from an ordinary man into a tragic figure, standing at the very center of an immense heroic trial. With Telephasa's death, all ties to his past, his childhood, and those glittering days in Phoenicia had been severed, and Cadmus had become a determined traveler walking into the unknown, toward his own legend, carrying nothing but an old pair of shoes, a staff in his hand, and a sharp sword at his waist. As the moment to meet the Delphic oracle, the great trial the gods had prepared for him, had drawn rapidly closer, the lands of Thrace would forever hold within them the tears he had shed, the suffering he had endured, and a mother's final breath. This silent, sorrowful, and dignified farewell had in truth been the most painful yet most necessary step on the road to the founding of Thebes, one of the greatest, most cursed, yet most magnificent cities history would ever know. Thus Cadmus had quietly departed from the misty shores of Thrace to write the great epic that would bear his name and be told for generations, leaving behind his greatest supporter, his mother, beneath a gravestone, and entrusting his hope of finding his sister to the supreme will of the gods. The mourning he carried in his heart had now become his greatest compass. After that foggy morning, when the fierce winds of Thrace had finally calmed and sorrow had settled upon his soul like an even heavier, darker mist than before, Cadmus, the homeless prince of Phoenicia, stood at the most difficult and decisive crossroads of his life. Behind him, he had left the body of his mother, Queen Telephassa, entrusted to the cold embrace of foreign lands, an extinguished hope, and the immense exhaustion brought on by a lifelong, futile search. While Cadmus had been cast from one end of the Mediterranean to the other in pursuit of his sister Europa, he had lost not only a principality, a home, and a future, but also the honor he once held in the eyes of his father, King Agenor. His father's command, which had echoed years earlier through the marble corridors of the Palace of Tyre, "Do not return without finding her," had, in the merciless gears of passing time, turned from a father's decree into an eternal sentence of exile, an irreversible curse. With Telephasa's final breath, Cadmus had felt with his entire being, down to the marrow of his bones, that he was now completely alone in the vast world, that any possibility of returning to Phoenicia had vanished entirely, and that the trace of his beloved sister Europa had been erased from the earth by a divine power itself. Yet the noble and proud blood of Poseidon, lord of the seas, which flowed through his veins, did not allow him to withdraw, drown in grief, or surrender. Realizing that he had reached the limits of mortal effort, human intellect and finite stubbornness, Cadmus decided to turn his course towards sacred Delphi, the earthly echo of wisdom, prophecy, and the gods. For he knew that where human strength ended, the word of the gods began. The road to Delphi had been filled with steep slopes, deep chasms, and desolate, unsettling paths that forced one to confront the deepest fears within. With every step he took, Cadmus relived again and again in his mind that fateful moment when Europa had mounted the enchanting white bull on the shore and vanished like a dream amid the foaming waves. When he reached the cloud-embraced foothills of Mount Parnassus, the sanctity of the air and the tangible weight of divine presence surrounded the young prince on all sides. As the ancient poet Ovid had described, the icy coolness of the Castalian grotto and the murmur of the nearby spring filtering through the rocks had offered Cadmus's weary mind a momentary peace. Yet the relentless unrest in his heart had continued to blow like a dark storm. As the prince approached the magnificent temple of Apollo, he knew that it had been not merely a sanctuary, but a divine threshold where fate itself was rewritten. In the dim, incense-filled atmosphere of the temple, he had fallen to his knees and laid before the god the heavy burden he had carried on his back like a hunch since the radiant, sunlit days of Phoenicia. He had asked only one question, simple in form, yet one whose answer would change not only his own life, but the history of the entire ancient world. Where was my sister Europa, and how could I find her? When that mysterious, powerful voice, rising as if from beneath the earth and mingled with the sharp scent of laurel, had echoed in Cadmus's ears, the answer had not been what the young prince had expected. Speaking through the oracle Pythia, Apollo's voice had declared with absolute certainty that Cadmus must immediately abandon the search for Europa, that she had been happy, that she had been elevated to queenship by a divine destiny, and that she would never return. This had been one of the most devastating, most heart-rending revelations a brother could hear. The sacred purpose for which he had sacrificed his years, his youth, and his family had been ended by a single divine breath. Yet the oracle had not sent Cadmus away alone with ruin and despair. Instead, she had offered him a far greater, far more magnificent, and entirely new fate. She had commanded him to abandon his futile searches and to follow a special cow that would appear before him. This cow had never borne a yoke upon its neck, nor had a heavy plough touched its back. It had been a sacred animal symbolizing freedom and an untamed spirit. Apollo's instruction had been as clear as an order and as mysterious as a prophecy. He was to follow the cow tirelessly until it grew weary and knelt down, and at the sacred spot where the animal first lay down to rest, he was to found a city that would be spoken of for centuries. When Cadmus emerged from the mysterious and heavy air of Delphi into the bright sunlight outside, he had no longer been merely a sorrowful exile searching for a lost sister, but a dignified leader, preparing to establish an entirely new civilization. Fate had firmly closed the door on his Phoenician past with Europa's disappearance, yet it had thrown wide open a vast gateway that would lead to the foundations of legendary Thebes. He had advanced with determined steps toward the lands of Phocis, waiting for the divine sign the oracle had described to appear. Before long, among the herds grazing on the wide pastures of King Pelagon of Phocis, he had noticed that miraculous creature of which the oracle had spoken. It had been a cow that stood apart immediately from the rest of the herd by its posture and nobility, bearing on each side a brilliant white luminous mark resembling the full moon or a shining crescent in the sky. Cadmus had begun to watch every step, every movement of the animal's head with reverence, as if fulfilling a divine testament. As Ovid had noted in his epic account, Cadmus had followed this cow silently, like a shadow, and with great respect, greeting in his heart this new path that Apollo had granted him. Throughout the journey, Cadmus had felt that the relentless curiosity gnawing at his heart about Europa's fate had slowly been replaced by a sacred excitement for the construction of a new home and the birth of a homeland. The unending anger of his father Agenor, the aching longing for Tyre, and the dark days of mourning in Thrace had faded behind him like clouds dissolving on the horizon. When the cow had passed through the rugged stony roads of Phocis, crossed the cool waters of the Cephisus River, and reached the fertile plains of Panope, the loyal men beside Cadmus had understood that they were witnessing a miracle and accompanying the writing of history. The only thing everyone had watched with held breath had been that divine guide, marked with the sign of the moon and shining even in darkness. Although Cadmus had not known exactly where this silent animal was leading him, he had been certain that the favor of the gods rested upon him, and that wise Minerva, Athena herself, would watch over him. This long and silent pursuit had been not only a geographic movement, but also the greatest proof of Cadmus's transformation from a homeless prince into a hero and a founding king. When the cow finally reached the unique green and fertile lands of Boeotia, the ancient weight that had long burdened Cadmus's heart had lightened with a sudden shiver. The animal had lifted its head toward the endless blue of the sky, bellowed loudly as if greeting unseen gods, and then with great calm knelt down and lay upon the fresh meadows. At that moment, for Cadmus, the search had ended. Exile had come to a close, and the great construction had begun. It had been that sacred, eternal instant. The prince had knelt, kissed the soil that was foreign, yet now destined to become his home, and offered his gratitude to the dwellers of Olympus. Europa's bright star had now shone in another sky, destined never to fade over the heavens of Crete. And Cadmus, here in this new homeland shaped by the echoing voice of Delphi, had been ready to lay the first mortar and set the first stones of the magnificent city that would bear his name, Thebes. Fate had not brought Europa back to him in the flesh, but it had granted him a kingdom, a people, an honor, and the task of carrying the Phoenician alphabet to Greek lands, forever altering the course of history. With the final sentence the voice of Delphi had whispered into his ear, it had heralded for him an entirely new life. Stop searching, for what you have found was the city that would rise in your hands. On that fertile land where this divine guidance had descended, Cadmus had set about uniting the noble memory of Phoenicia with the promise of the gods, writing the bloodiest yet most magnificent chapters of an immortal epic and bringing an entire civilization into existence from nothing. When Cadmus left the incense-scented, shadowed and mysterious atmosphere of Delphi, where divine whispers echoed in every corner, he carried in his heart both the bitter sorrow of an era closing and the immense weight of an unknown beginning pressing upon his shoulders. Apollo, the lord of the heavens and prophecy, had commanded him through the oracle Pythia in a firm and unquestionable manner to abandon the search for his sister Europa. That command had abruptly frozen the desperate pursuit that had lasted for years, the effort to seek his sister's trace in every wave that struck the shores. Yet the god had not left Cadmus homeless, purposeless, and grieving on his own. The divine instruction given to him was clearer than any map. He was to follow a free cow that had never submitted to any yoke, whose neck had never been crushed beneath a harness or a heavy plow, and he was to found his new city and new homeland at the place where the animal first collapsed from exhaustion and struck its knees upon the earth. As he descended from the steep rocky slopes of Mount Parnassus, drifting like a shadow away from the icy coolness of the Castalian cave and its springs of wisdom toward the lands of Phocis, Cadmus began to search for this new, silent guide of his fate with great care, almost holding his breath. Before long, among the herds grazing on the vast, fertile pastures of Pelagon, the king of Phocis, he saw that miraculous animal, which immediately stood apart from all the other cattle through its nobility and bearing. This cow bore the perfect sign described by the oracle. On its flank, there was a bright, pure white mark, resembling the full moon that lit the night or a silvery crescent. There was neither a trace of chafing on its neck, nor the slightest callus left by hard labor. It was an untouched and sacred being, reflecting the free will of the gods upon the earth. When Cadmus saw this clear and indisputable sign of Apollo, a deep reverence filled his soul. The exiled prince of Phoenicia grasped his staff firmly and began to follow the cow with silent, dignified, and resolute steps. This sacred journey of tracking became a complete test of patience and faith for the Phoenician prince and his loyal men, who had bound their fates to his. The cow moved through the rugged roads and steep paths of Phocis with a free and willful manner, as if it were following a hidden compass, and Cadmus followed its every step and every pause with the care of one reading a sacred text. Along the way, Cadmus silently offered prayers and gratitude in his heart to Phoebus Apollo, the Lord of Light and the true architect of this path. At times the cow slowed, plucked a fresh shoot, and at other times crossed winding paths with a confident, swift pace, yet the crescent-shaped white mark upon it continued to shine like a torch at every hour of the day. Cadmus's companions, after years of a fruitless search for Europa that had exhausted their spirits, forgot even their heaviest fatigue for the first time, carried by the immense excitement of having a tangible, visible, and divine goal. As the fertile yet rugged lands of Phocis were left behind, the first physical steps of the passage from chaos to order, from exile to kingship, were taken upon these dusty and sacred roads. As the journey deepened, the divine guide and the small army following it reached the shallow valleys and flowing waters of the Cephissus River. The fresh scent of the water and the sound of its flow brought a measure of calm to the complex and stormy thoughts in Cadmus's mind. They crossed the shallow fords of the river with great care, and then arrived at the broad plains of Panope, stretching all the way to the horizon. These plains were virgin lands, not yet touched by the axe of civilization, where nature ruled with all its wildness and pure beauty. At every pause of the cow and every lift of its head, Cadmus asked himself, "Is this the sacred place?" Yet his guide set out again each time, drawing him farther onward, toward his true homeland, toward the center where his fate was sealed. The lunar mark upon the animal grew even more distinct beneath the orange light of the evening sun, guiding them even in the dark like a messenger of the moon descended from the sky. Cadmus's steps had now completely crossed the borders of Phocis and turned toward the lands that had awaited his fate for centuries, toward Boeotia. When the cow finally set foot upon the lands of Boeotia, it began to move with a different, more vivid and mystical energy, as if it sensed that it was nearing its purpose. Cadmus and his men could see that the animal's steps had grown heavier and that its noble body was beginning to tire. As the sun was about to complete its great circuit in the sky, shadows began to stretch across the earth like enormous fingers. This long walk was not merely the crossing of a physical distance, it was also the process of uniting and blending the noble past Cadmus had brought from Phoenicia with the yet unwritten, glorious future of Boeotia. When the cow reached a vast plain adorned with fresh grasses and wildflowers, it suddenly stopped. The animal raised its head, along with its magnificent pointed horns, toward the endless sky and filled the air with deep, echoing bellows that seemed to shake earth and heaven alike. As this sound spread in waves across the desolate plains of Boeotia, it seemed to announce to all the hidden spirits of nature, to the nymphs of the trees and the ancient powers of the soil, the arrival of a hero, of a founder. The moment of the sacred halt was not merely a rest for Cadmus, but the greatest and most shattering turning point of his life. After saluting the sky and the unseen gods, the cow turned its head back with heavy dignity and cast a deep, meaningful, and compassionate gaze at Cadmus and his companions, who had followed it with determination, faith, and loyalty, as if it understood everything. Then, no longer able to carry its massive and weary body, it lay down on its side upon the fresh green grass in the embrace of the soft earth. This was the final sign spoken of by Apollo, who had inspired the Delphic oracle. The place where the animal collapsed was the sacred ground where the heart of a civilization would beat, where the foundations of Thebes, destined to become the subject of legends for thousands of years, would be laid. When Cadmus saw this surrender, this divine exhaustion of the animal, his soul filled with great reverence, gratitude, and tears. Right there upon the dusty ground, he fell to his knees and pressed long, fervent kisses upon the earth to salute this unknown yet now blood-deep homeland. Addressing the foreign mountains before him, the dense forests, the distant riverbeds, and the boundless plains, he proclaimed to the entire cosmos that these lands had now found their new master, protector, and king. On this silent and desolate plain, Cadmus immediately began preparations to repay his debt of gratitude to the gods and to seal this sacred moment. As the vision of that immense city with walls rising to the sky slowly took shape in his mind, he knew that his first duty was to sacrifice this divine guide who had led him to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war. This green meadow where the cow had collapsed was no longer merely a place where an animal had rested. It was a divine center where the will of the heavens and the possibilities of the earth had united, the new axis of the world. For the first time since leaving the gleaming shores of Phoenicia, After so many years of exile and mourning, Cadmus truly felt that he belonged somewhere and was ready to take root. Apollo's prophecy had been fulfilled without the slightest deviation, and the unending fatigue of the search had transformed into the sacred excitement of building and creation. The sorrowful, homeless, exiled prince who had wandered the world in pursuit of Europa was gone. In his place stood the unshakable founder of Thebes and a wise king chosen by the gods. The lands of Boeotia, under the silent witness of the dappled cow lying peacefully upon them, were now fully ready to host one of history's most glorious, bloodiest, and wisest legends. As Cadmus sent his men to the nearby wooded area to bring the sacred and pure water required for the sacrifice, the dark secrets lying in the depths of these lands, the terror-spreading dragon of the war god Ares, and the bloody, deadly confrontation to come were not yet visible on the horizon. For now, only the endless and serene silence born of a divine promise fulfilled covered the entire plain. Cadmus rested his sword upon the ground and watched the sunset, the first evening of his new kingdom, with great pride. The unfortunate Prince Cadmus, who had left behind the silver-shimmering shores of Phoenicia and the unreachable splendor of his father King Agenor's palace in Tyre, many long, exhausting, and sorrow-filled years earlier, had finally reached the sacred land that fate had offered him like a promise, the fertile and untouched bosom of Boeotia. This noble exile had left behind his youth, spent searching for his sister Europa, his years of despair, and the heavy mourning of his mother, Queen Telephassa, whom he had entrusted to the harsh and merciless winds of Thrace, and he had followed with deep reverence and surrender the mysterious divine sign he had received from the oracle of Delphi. When the dappled cow, which had guided him like a star from the lands of Phocis with the full moon mark shining on its flank, collapsed to its knees from exhaustion and rested its head upon the soil, the breast of his new homeland, Cadmus understood that the search had ended. The exile had come to a close and the great construction had begun. Freed by divine will from the task of finding Europa, whom Zeus, the absolute ruler of the heavens, had cunningly abducted, the prince now greeted with love and tears this foreign yet sacred place where, by the command of the gods themselves, he was destined to lay the unshakable foundations of a new civilization. In order to show his deep gratitude for this divine guidance, and to offer thanks to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, who would assume the protection of the city he would found, Cadmus decided, as he had promised Apollo's oracle, to sacrifice the cow immediately there. The process of preparing the sacrifice was not merely a religious ceremony for Cadmus, but also the most powerful symbol of the rebirth from ashes of the royal honor he had carried in his soul since Phoenicia upon these new lands. For this sacred and flawless rite to be offered to the goddess, the most vital missing element was pure water from a living spring that no mortal hand had ever touched, water that would be poured over the sacrifice and cleanse the ritual of sin. Cadmus surveyed the steep, impassable rocks around him and the dense forests rising toward the sky with the sharpness of an eagle, and he considered where the most suitable source for this divine duty might be hidden. At his side stood a group of brave men who had accompanied him with unshakable loyalty since Phoenicia, sharing the hardships of exile, hunger, and thirst with him as if they had been his own brothers. Turning to this group, which included distinguished and courageous companions such as Diolian and Seriphus, Cadmus ordered them to bring sacred water from the nearby shaded and cool valley. The men, carrying heavy bronze vessels expertly forged by skilled hands, set off joyfully, singing as they went into the depths of the valley and toward that ominous greenery, determined to fulfill their lord's command and contribute to the first sacrificial rite to touch the soil of this new homeland. In this virgin and untouched corner of Boeotia, during those hot hours when the sun blazed like a coal at the highest point of the sky and the shadows shrank in fear, Cadmus's men noticed that nature grew cloaked in an eerie stillness, resembling the silence of a grave as they advanced deeper into the forest. Their journey brought them to an ancient and dark grove so old that no human axe had ever dared to enter it, where the branches of ancient trees covered the sky like armor. As the ancient poet Ovid had described with words that pierced to the bone, at the very heart of this woodland lay a mysterious dark cave woven with dense bushes, pliant branches and vines, where massive stones formed a natural arch. Icy cold and powerful streams flowed from the depths of the cave, nourishing the exotic vegetation around it and giving the place an atmosphere that was as enchanting as it was ominous, making the hair on one's skin stand on end. This place was the sacred Ismenian spring dedicated to Ares, the god of war, and the glass-like clarity of its waters skillfully concealed the ancient terror that lay in its depths. Cadmus's companions were completely unaware that this spring was not only a treasure belonging to the gods, but also a death trap under the personal protection of Ares, one that fed on blood. When the Phoenician warriors reached the edge of the spring and plunged their heavy bronze urns into the icy, crystal-clear waters, the echoing roar made by the vessels as they filled with water burst through the silent grove like a cry of war. At that very moment of terror, from the darkest, sunless passages of the cave appeared the dread guardian, descended from the very lineage of Ares and keeping watch over these sacred waters for thousands of years without ever blinking an eye. This massive dragon was a being that froze the blood and shattered the minds of all who beheld it, not only because of its size, but also because of the divine hatred it possessed. Its golden yellow, sharp crests gleamed like torches of hell in the seeping sunlight, and from its eyes poured pure fury and blazing fire. Its body was swollen with the weight of centuries of accumulated venom, and its three-forked tongues extended outward like whips of death from between three rows of razor-sharp teeth. As the dragon's towering, scaly body slid out of the mouth of the cave, the sound of its scales grinding against one another echoed through the grove like the metallic music of an approaching catastrophe. When the Phoenicians filling water at the spring saw this horrific creature torn from nightmares, they dropped their vessels from their hands and felt the blood in their veins turn to ice, for the enemy before them was far beyond any mortal power of sword or shield. The dragon lunged toward them with the speed of lightning, drawing massive coils and filling the air with furious, poisonous hisses. According to Ovid's account, the size of this celestial serpent was as great as the enormous constellations that encircled the pole star in the sky. Some of the men made a final effort to grasp their weapons, while others attempted to flee in paralyzing terror. But the Guardian's divine speed and devastating wrath allowed none of them even the slightest chance. The monster seized the noble companions one by one. It tore some apart with its powerful bone-crushing teeth, crushed the breath from others with its massive, suffocating coils, and left others lifeless instantly with the ominous, dark, burning venom it spewed from its mouth. In a short time, the clear and sacred waters of the spring were stained red with the fresh blood of Cadmus's most loyal and bravest men, and the peaceful coolness of the grove gave way to the heavy metallic stench of death. Cadmus waited with impatience and growing anxiety on the silent plain where the cow had collapsed and awaited sacrifice to Athena. The sun had already passed its peak in the sky, and time tightened like a noose with every passing second around the prince's unease, that the men with whom he had overcome every storm, every monster and every sorrow since Phoenicia, were delayed in so simple a task as fetching water stirred his heroic instincts and warrior spirit. Finally, unable to wait any longer, Cadmus threw his lion-skin cloak over his shoulders and took up his heavy bronze spear and sharp sword, deciding to follow the trail of his men. When he entered the dark grove where the sun could not penetrate, seeking to learn what had happened to the companions he loved more than his own life, and considered brothers, he did not yet know how great a sorrow and how bloody and savage a battle awaited him. The sight he saw as he approached the spring was the most painful and heart-rending scene of his heroic trial. The shattered, unrecognizable bodies of his friends lying on the ground, and the massive, scaly monster coldly licking the blood of his companions with an air of triumph. There, at the sight of the spilled blood, Cadmus swore a sacred oath. Either he would take revenge for these loyal friends by sending this monster to hell, or he would be buried with them forever in the dark bosom of this foreign land. This moment marked the beginning of the first bloodshed for civilization on the soil of Boeotia, and of the most brutal and savage clash on the road to the founding of legendary Thebes. In the untouched, savage lands of Boeotia, during those scorching hours when the sun stood like an executioner at the very peak of the sky and the shadows shrank in fear to their shortest forms, Cadmus, the exiled prince of Phoenicia, faced the greatest, most brutal and bloodiest trial of his life. The long and arduous years that had passed since he had left the magnificent palace of King Agenor in Tyre, with a vow in his heart to find his sister Europa, had not only hardened him physically like steel, but had also transformed him spiritually into an epic hero. Having followed the sacred cow, marked by the full moon through the rugged paths of Phocis, and reached the fertile plains of Boeotia, Cadmus had stopped at that holy spot, where his divine guide had collapsed from exhaustion and rested its head upon the earth. This place had been the promised new homeland of the gods, the heart of the future legendary city of Thebes. Yet founding a city had not meant merely stacking stones upon one another. It had also meant subduing the ancient, dark and jealous powers of that land. As Cadmus prepared to sacrifice the sacred cow in order to offer his deepest gratitude to Phoebus Apollo, who had whispered this path to him, and to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who had protected him like a shadow, he had sent his most loyal companions into the nearby ancient forest to bring back pure, untouched water for the ritual. Time had moved slowly under the weight of anxiety, yet the brave men he had sent had not appeared on the horizon. Cadmus had begun to feel a cold fear in his heart because of the delay of these steadfast men with whom he had endured every hardship since Phoenicia, and on whose shoulders he had wept while burying his mother Telephassa in the freezing winds of Thrace. At last, he could wait no longer. He had thrown over his shoulders the imposing cloak, stripped from a lion's hide, armed himself with his heavy, steel-tipped spear gleaming in the sunlight and his bone-cutting sword, and plunged into the depths of the dark grove. As he went deeper into the forest, the air had grown heavier. A metallic scent had mixed with the smell of damp earth, and the cheerful chirping of birds had given way to a deadly stillness, like the silence of a grave. When Cadmus had slipped like a shadow between the massive trees and reached the sacred spring of Ares, he had encountered a sight so horrifying that it extinguished the light in his eyes. The mutilated, unrecognizable bodies of his companions lay scattered on the ground, and towering over them in a posture of triumph had stood a colossal monster, its scales stained with blood. This had been a dreadful dragon, descended directly from Ares, the god of war, and the ancient, merciless guardian of the sacred waters. According to the descriptions of the ancient poet Ovid, this creature had resembled a living emissary of hell on earth, with its terrifying golden crests and the fire of hatred blazing from its eyes. Its massive body had been swollen with venom. Its forked tongue had spread a deadly vapor into the air with every hiss, and the 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth in its mouth had waited to grind its victims to pieces. The dragon's size had been so immense that when it reared up with its entire body, it had towered even over the oldest trees of the forest, standing like a living terror, as if the Draco constellation itself had descended from the sky and taken on flesh and bone. When Cadmus had seen this monster coldly licking the blood of the companions he had considered brothers, his heart had been seized by the blazing fire of vengeance. Crying out, "Either I will live as a glorious hero who avenged you, or I will fall into the earth with you on this sacred path," he had begun the great duel that would be told for thousands of years. Cadmus had delivered the first and fiercest move of the trial of heroism. With the strength born of rage, he had lifted a massive boulder from the ground, one so huge that 2 men could not have raised it, and hurled it at the monster. This enormous stone had struck the dragon's body with a force capable of leveling even the walls of the strongest fortresses, yet the creature's shining armor-like scales and thick hide had absorbed the blow as if it had been a mere breeze. The dragon had suffered no wound, but this audacious attack had driven its divine fury to its peak. The monster had lunged at Cadmus, drawing vast coils and shaking the ground. White poisonous foam had sprayed from its mouth, and it had fouled the air with every breath. At the last moment, Cadmus had leapt aside with the agility granted by the lion's hide on his back, and had fixed his sharp eyes on the dragon's single weak point in its armor, the relatively softer curve of the spine where the scales joined. With a masterful thrust of his javelin, he had opened a deep wound directly in the middle of the monster's back. The iron tip had driven all the way into its lungs, introducing it to pain for the first time. Driven mad by this unexpected agony, the dragon had twisted its head backward with great speed and had tried to shatter the spear lodged in its back with its powerful teeth. However, the steel point had been wedged like a lock between the bones. Pain had made this proud offspring of Ares even more savage and unpredictable. The veins in its neck had swollen like thick ropes, and the terrifying sounds it had emitted had echoed throughout the entire Boeotian valley. Cadmus had skillfully retreated to protect himself from the monster's tree-toppling tail strikes and bone-crushing coils, while at the same time using his lance to block the venom-spitting mouth that had constantly attacked his face. The duel had no longer been merely a struggle for survival. It had become an absolute contest of will between human determination and divine terror. The poisonous saliva dripping from the creature had instantly burned the green grass into ash, and Cadmus's shield had been slowly crushed under the dragon's relentless hammer-like blows. At last, Cadmus had caught a brief opening caused by the dragon's momentary exhaustion or arrogance, and had hurled his spear with all his strength toward the monster's exposed throat. As the dragon had tried to retreat in mortal panic, Cadmus had leapt upon it like a lion, and had driven the spearhead into its gullet, pinning it as if with a nail to a massive oak tree behind it. The creature's neck had been fixed against the hard trunk of the tree. Pressing the spear with the full weight of his body, Cadmus had ended the monster's life there, at the head of the sacred spring. Under the weight of the dragon's colossal body, the great oak tree had bent, and the forest had shaken with the final violent thrashes of its dying tail. At last, the creature's ear-splitting, dreadful hissing had ceased, and a heavy, blood-scented, victorious silence had settled over the forests of Boeotia. As Cadmus, breathless and drenched in sweat mixed with blood, had looked upon the immense foe he had slain, he had been startled by a mysterious, echoing voice rising from the depths of the forest. "Why, son of Agenor, did you gaze with such admiration and pride upon the dragon you killed? One day you too will be gazed upon by others as a dragon." This chilling, dark prophecy had shaken Cadmus's soul deeply, yet a divine intervention that did not allow terror to take hold had occurred at that very moment. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, had appeared beside her hero, gliding down from the heavens like a beam of light. The goddess had told Cadmus not to fear, had said that this bloody victory had been the herald of a great birth, and had given him that strange, frightening command that would lay the foundations of a new civilization. "Pull out the dragon's teeth and bury them with your own hands in this soil you have plowed. They will be the seeds of your future people." This divine intervention by Athena had been the most critical moment that transformed Cadmus from a monster slayer into a legendary founder of cities. Following the instructions of Pallas Athena, Cadmus had removed the massive, blood-stained teeth one by one from the dragon's mouth, and obeying the command he had received from the Oracle of Delphi, had carefully planted these mortal seeds in the fertile womb of the soil he had tilled. Cadmus had finally cast off the old gnawing sorrow caused by his failure to find his sister Europa, and had closed the darkest and most triumphant chapter of the mighty epic that would bear his name. As he had stood ready with his sword in hand for the new and mysterious battle, he would fight against the terrible army soon to spring from the planted teeth. The Spartoi, the lands of Boeotia, had already been saluting their new master Cadmus, the dragon slayer and bearer of the torch of civilization. On the virgin and fertile lands of Boeotia, beside the sacred spring of Ares, there reigned a heavy, metallic and blood-soaked silence that represented one of the greatest and most shattering turning points in the life of Cadmus, the exiled prince of Phoenicia. The long and agonizing years that had passed since he had left King Agenor's magnificent palace in Tyre, bearing in his heart the oath to find his sister Europa, had transformed Cadmus not only into a seeker, but also into a hero whose soul had been hardened like steel by the harshest trials of fate. In the epic and savage duel he had just fought alone, he had killed the dragon of Ares, which had spread terror with its golden crests and poisonous breath, pinning it as if to an oak tree. Yet this immense victory had been overshadowed by the sight of the torn and bloodied bodies of his most loyal companions. While the waters of the spring, once crystal clear, had been stained red by the fresh blood of the noble men from Tyre, Cadmus had begun to think, with a deep and suffocating sorrow, about how he would build alone the great city promised to him by the gods, now that he was utterly alone in the vast world, a homeless and forsaken exile. At that very moment of despair, Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, descended like a beam of light from the sky, appeared beside the hero, and delivered the strange, chilling, and divine command that would change the course of history forever. Do not be afraid, son of Agenor. Pull out the dragon's teeth and bury them with your own hands in this land you have plowed, for they will become the seeds of your future people and your unshakable civilization. Although Cadmus had not fully grasped the mystical mystery within the goddess's words, he had submitted without question to that higher divine will that had guided him like a shadow ever since the oracle of Delphi. With fingers strong as iron, he had begun to pull out one by one the white razor-sharp teeth from the still warm jaws of the massive dragon, feeling the immense, savage, and destructive energy that lay within the rough surface of each tooth. Following Athena's instructions, he had deeply split the soil of the fertile plain where the sacred cow had first collapsed from exhaustion, and with great patience and curiosity, he had placed these mortal seeds into the earth. Fate, which had followed him like an unseen hand since Phocis, now awaited the sprouting of these ominous seeds, the earth's metallic act of birth. When Cadmus stepped back a few paces and held his breath, he witnessed, within seconds, the beginning of a massive stirring beneath the ground, a divine movement. As the ancient poet Ovid had described in his immense and terrifying imagery, this was not an ordinary sprouting, but the earth vomiting forth an army. First, shining spear points had burst from the soil like deadly ears of grain. Immediately afterward, helmets adorned with multicolored plumes and gleaming with golden embroidery had emerged from beneath the ground, as if an entire legion had been climbing from pitch-black darkness into daylight. As Cadmus watched in awe and terror, powerful and muscular shoulders had risen first, then magnificent chests covered in heavy armor, and finally, fully equipped giant warriors armed with swords and shields. Just like actors who suddenly appeared on stage when theater curtains rose during festival ceremonies, these warriors had been born from the earth as a single body and had quickly turned into a frightening crowd resembling a vast army. These sown men, or in their own language the Spartoi, had stood firm like rocks before Cadmus, bearing the raw, savage, and uncontrollable power they had taken from the soil. However, within the nature of this army that had burst from the ground, there had been no peace, calm, or mercy. They had inherited the furious, jealous, and warlike spirit of the slain dragon of Ares. When Cadmus, fearing that so many and such savage warriors would attack him at a single signal, had moved to grasp his sword, the wise voice of Athena had echoed once more in his mind. Applying the tactic of the goddess, or according to some darker legends, of the cunning sorceress Medea herself, Cadmus had thrown a massive stone into the middle of the warriors. When one of them had been struck by the hard blow, he had believed that the attack had come from one of his own brothers and had turned in blind rage against the one beside him. Not even a weak voice shouting "Stop!" had been enough to prevent this bloody and senseless civil war. The Spartoi had immediately turned on one another, and the very short lives granted to them by the earth had turned into madness and destruction. As the clash of swords, the crashing of bronze armor, and muffled cries of death had echoed across the plains of Boeotia, Cadmus had stood frozen, watching this horrific spectacle, the sight of these sown brothers destroying one another and soaking the very soil of their birth with their warm blood. The battle had been so violent and so relentless that within a short time only a handful remained from that massive, seemingly invincible army. At this critical moment, through the divine intervention of Athena, the fighting had suddenly ceased, and the 5 most distinguished and powerful warriors who had survived among the Spartoi had knelt before Cadmus to make peace and submit to him. These heroes had been Echion, Udaios, Chthonios, Hyperenor, and Peloros. This sacred 5 had sworn an eternal oath of loyalty and peace to Cadmus, and had agreed to enter his service, laying their weapons upon the blood-soaked ground. From that point on, the noble Phoenician heritage Cadmus had brought from Tyre, and the wild power that had burst from the soil of Boeotia, had been united in an unbreakable alliance. These 5 warriors would later become the ancestors of all the nobles and aristocracy of Thebes, and together with Cadmus, they would lay the first stones and foundations of the Cadmeia citadel, the heart and mind of the city. Thus, this miraculous and bloody event, which had begun with the sowing of the dragon's teeth, had inscribed the famous legend of the sown men into the golden pages of history at the founding of Thebes. Cadmus had completely set aside his futile and soul-draining search for his sister Europa, and had focused with great determination on building the foundations of a new civilization, his own kingdom, together with these loyal warriors born from the earth. Yet this victory, this bloody birth, and the peace that had been won had carried a heavy price. Ares, the fierce god of war and the father of the dragon he had killed, would condemn Cadmus to a harsh and exhausting period of atonement lasting 8 years, a term of servitude in payment for his son's death. As Cadmus shook hands with the Spartoi and looked upon his new homeland, he had not thought of the Phoenician shores he had left behind, but of the impregnable walls of Thebes that would rise before him like a sun, and of the glorious yet equally painful and tragic future that this earth-born alliance would bring. After this bloody and miraculous birth, the plains of Boeotia had been fully ready to host their new masters and the great and immortal city they would build. On the fertile and boundless plains of Boeotia, when the savage clash of swords that had echoed at the sacred spring of Ares finally gave way to a deep, solemn, and meaningful silence, the gates of a new era that would alter the course of history were fully opened for Cadmus, the exiled prince of Phoenicia. The proud young prince who had once spent joyful days on golden sands with his sister Europa, under the protective care of his father King Agenor and his mother Telephassa, in the purple-hued magnificent palaces of the city of Tyre, now stood alone thousands of leagues from his homeland, at the very center of a dangerous plain, whose soil had been watered with the blood of a dragon. In his effort to find his sister, whom Zeus had abducted after taking the form of a snow-white bull, he had crossed the Mediterranean from end to end, searching for a fragment of hope in every harbor. He had buried his only mother in the harsh and merciless winds of Thrace, and by the command of the Delphic oracle to abandon the search and walk toward your own fate, he had transformed from an exile into a conqueror. Cadmus had followed the divine cow bearing a silver crescent mark, like a faithful shadow from the lands of Phocis, and at this sacred spot, where the animal had collapsed from exhaustion and released its breath, he had received the heavy yet honorable sign to found a civilization. Yet this foundation had not been achieved through prayers, but through blood and sweat. The fearsome dragon of Ares had torn apart his most loyal companions, and Cadmus had subdued this monster alone, proving his heroism to all the gods. Then, by the command of Athena, from the dragon's teeth that he had sown into the earth, a terrifying army had burst forth, and after a brief but devastating internal war among themselves, only 5 brave and unyielding warriors had remained. These 5 men, Echion, Eudaeus, Chthonius, Hyperinor, and Pelorus, had knelt before Cadmus as symbols of peace, a new covenant, and unshakable loyalty. They had not been merely nameless warriors born from the dark womb of the earth, but the sown men who would carry the first stones of the great city to be built upon their shoulders. As Cadmus looked at these massive, naturally armored allies who carried dragon fire in their eyes, he briefly remembered the white-sailed ships of the harbor of Tyre, his childhood memories, and his father's unyielding authority. Yet that former life had now existed only as a misty dream. The immense task rising before him had been to build an immortal kingdom, a citadel of reason upon these virgin and untamed lands. When the construction of the city began, Cadmus and the 5 surviving Spartoi first decided to establish a fortress that would serve as the center of both defense and unassailable authority. This fortress, initially named Cadmeia, to eternally preserve the name of its founder, began to rise on a strategic height overlooking the plains of Boeotia, immediately beside the pure waters of the Ismenian spring. The labor of the Spartoi manifested itself at a pace and with a grandeur that mortal workers could not even have imagined. These 5 warriors born from the earth, bearing the divine dragon heritage in their veins, carried enormous blocks of stone as if they had been feathers and wove the fortress walls with the precision of a divine architecture. As each stone settled into place with a resounding crash, Cadmus blended in his mind the ancient seafaring wisdom of Phoenicia, its engineering genius, and the mysterious prophecies of Delphi. The epic of foundation had been written each morning as a new wall rose with the sunrise and challenged the sky. As Cadmus planned the gates and the impregnable walls of his fortress, he did not forget his deep respect for the celestial powers that had protected him. As the most beautiful pages of legend had recounted, 7 great gates had been built, and each of these gates had been dedicated to the 7 planets and the 7 great gods as a sign of Cadmus's universal wisdom and knowledge of astronomy. This city had not been merely a settlement or a refuge. It had also been a perfect reflection on Earth of the order in the heavens, an experiment in cosmos. As the city rose, Cadmus wove a civilization not only with cold stone, but also with immortal signs. He had begun to adapt the mysterious and magical signs he had brought from Phoenicia, the alphabet, to the language and the spirit of this new people and this new land. These first letters, carved into the high walls of Cadmeia and the marble columns of the temples, would become the glorious beginning of literacy and enduring history on Greek soil, marking the dispersal of darkness. Cadmus had set aside his warrior's sword and taken up the pen and the hammer, bringing the light of reason, law, and writing to these wild lands ruled by brute force. As the Spartoi watched with admiration the intellectual genius and vision of their lord, the foundations of a great city rose upon the strong shoulders of these 5 noble lineages born from the earth. As the ancestors of the future noble families of Thebes, they had added not only their sweat, but also their unshakable loyalty drawn from the soil into the mortar of the fortress. When the fortress of Cadmeia was completed, it appeared from below from the plain, like a magnificent eagle's nest defying the sky. During this painful yet monumental process, Cadmus had found consolation by thinking of the civilization his sister Europa would establish in Crete, or the successes of his brothers Phoenix and Cilix in distant lands that bore their names. Although he had set out as an exile driven from his homeland, he had now established with this magnificent city an authority that would rival and perhaps overshadow the kingdom of his father Agenor. The construction of the city had been not only a physical structure, but also an absolute victory in the passage from chaos to cosmos, from dark disorder to enlightened civilization. Cadmus had slain the savagery of the dragon and had used the raw energy born from that savagery to build the city's protective walls. The foundations of Thebes, then known as Cadmeia, had now been laid in a manner that history itself could not shake. The lands of Boeotia had been reshaped by the vision of a prince from Phoenicia and by the labor of 5 warriors who had emerged from the womb of the earth. As the streets of this vast city had been planned with meticulous order, Cadmus had placed in every corner a temple, an altar, or a sign in honor of the gods. This first phase of the foundation had been the most tangible and enduring legacy of Cadmus as a hero upon the earth. Yet the rise of Cadmeia's cloud-reaching walls had also marked the beginning of a new chapter in the complex and dangerous relationship with the gods. For the time to serve the war, god Ares, as payment for the slain dragon, had been drawing closer with every passing second. Even so, the brilliance of this magnificent city had already begun to illuminate the entire ancient world. Founded by an army born from the earth, this city had left an indelible mark on the dusty pages of history, engraving the name of Cadmus forever upon stone and upon hearts. On the fertile plains of Boeotia, as the massive walls of the newly founded fortress of Cadmeia began to rise toward the sky, Prince Cadmus, who had set out from the coasts of Phoenicia weary, proud, yet possessed of an unshakable will, stood face to face with the heaviest, most humiliating, and most spiritual trial of his life. From the splendid days in King Agenor's ivory palaces in Tyre to the endless, hopeless search for his sister Europa, from the mournful dawns when he laid his mother Telephassa to rest in the harsh winds of Thrace, to the command of the Delphic oracle to follow the mysterious cow marked by the sign of the moon. Every step had in fact prepared him for this great moment of purification. Cadmus had slain the ancient dragon that guarded the sacred spring of the war god Ares, and by sowing its teeth into the earth, he had forged an eternal pact of peace with the 5 noble Spartoi who survived a bloody civil war: Echion, Audaios, Chthonios, Hyperenor, and Peloros. Yet the price of the spilled sacred blood had been heavy, for the slain creature had not been an ordinary monster, but a holy guardian descended from Ares himself and under his protection. Although Cadmus had defeated the dragon through the strategic genius of Athena and had laid the foundations of his city with the men born from the earth, he now had to confront the wrath of the fiercest and most merciless god of the heavens. Divine punishment had stood before Cadmus as an inevitable and shattering fate. Ancient legends and the trembling accounts of the poets stated that, to appease this blood feud, Ares had demanded a superhuman atonement from Cadmus. This punishment required the noble prince of Phoenicia to serve Ares like a slave, in the lowest of tasks, for a full 8 years. According to the mystical understanding of that age, this 8-year span had been called the Eternal Year, Iniautos, a sacred period in which the celestial cycles were completed. For this proud prince, once a master of the Mediterranean, who had marched armies at his command and carried in his veins the noble blood of the sea god Poseidon, slavery had undoubtedly been a trial heavier than the cold breath of death. Yet Cadmus had learned his most important lesson on the rugged roads he had traveled in search of Europa. To resist the will of the gods had been like whistling against a storm. To protect his city, his newly founded Cadmeia, and the Spartoi people who had sworn loyalty to him from divine destruction, he had set aside his royal scepter and golden crown and had accepted becoming the unchained slave of Ares. Throughout the 8-year period of atonement, Cadmus had labored day and night to fulfill the endless and at times unimaginable commands of the war god. In this process, he had proven to all of Olympus not only the physical strength of his arms, but also the depth of his character and soul. As noted in the writings of Apollodorus and in ancient wisdom, for a human to serve so faithfully for such a long time under divine punishment had stripped the soul of all arrogance and had allowed it to evolve from a mere mortal into a hero. Cadmus had cleansed the sacred precincts of Ares, prepared the sacrifices to be offered in the god's honor, and, like a simple laborer, had carried stones in the construction of magnificent temples that might soothe the war god's unquenched fury over the blood of his slain offspring. During those long years, the 5 Spartoi who watched him from within the walls of Cadmeia had been unable to hide their admiration for their king, a ruler who worked like a slave for his people and their future had become, for the future noble families of Thebes, an unshakable and eternal example of justice, sacrifice, and fear of the gods. While Cadmus heard from distant merchants that his sister Europa shone like a star as a queen in Crete, he himself quietly endured his suffering there on the dusty lands of Boeotia to appease the wrath of a god. Time passed slowly, painfully yet resolutely, like marble stones gradually worn down by harsh winds and rain. By the final day of the 8th year, Cadmus had become not only a dragon slayer, but also a hero forged by suffering, the greatest earthly embodiment of patience, loyalty, and humility. Ares, the Lord of War, accepted that the blood price of his son, the sacred dragon, had been paid with every drop of sweat, and his long-burning anger was appeased. As the end of the atonement approached, the invisible yet heavy yoke of slavery upon Cadmus was lifted through the admiring intervention of the gods themselves. For Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, who had protected her hero like a shadow from the beginning, saw that he had emerged from this harshest and most humiliating trial with honor, his soul even greater, and she began to prepare the seat of a glorious kingship for him. Freed from the service of Ares, Cadmus was no longer merely an exiled prince or a servant of a god. In the eyes of both mortals and the inhabitants of Olympus, he had proven his maturity and had earned the right to become the legitimate, powerful, and wise ruler of Thebes. Cadmus's full ascension to the throne of Thebes was like the sun of civilization rising after darkness on the lands of Boeotia. Guided by Athena as he took his seat, Cadmus did not merely rule a city with an iron fist. He also changed the course of human history forever by gifting the Greek people with the magnificent treasure he had brought from Phoenicia, the alphabet. At the end of the 8-year period of slavery, the gods carried their favor toward him to an unimaginable height. With the direct intervention of Zeus and the consent of Ares, Cadmus was given as his wife Harmonia, the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, whose beauty left tongues speechless. This marriage was the highest divine reward a mortal man could receive, offered in memory of all the suffering Cadmus had endured, every drop of sweat he had shed, and the companions he had lost. From the bottomless sorrow he had once felt at failing to find Europa, Cadmus had now reached an unshakable splendor, rising upon the impregnable walls of his own kingdom with the divine spouse at his side. Thus, Cadmus's debt to Ares became one of the most fundamental and instructive cornerstones of the glorious history of Thebes. This long and arduous 8-year atonement was the most vivid and tragic example of how a hero became a ruler and how an exile became a founder of civilization. Cadmus was no longer merely the leader of warriors born from the earth, but a king personally approved by the gods, who had attained wisdom by completing his ordeal. As the former servant of Ares sat upon his throne as the absolute master of the Boeotian plains, the great civilization born from the dragon's teeth he had sown was on the verge of becoming an epic that would echo around his name for centuries. The long and exhausting journey of Cadmus, which had begun in Tyre, opened after this 8-year dark tunnel toward the bright and unextinguishable lights of the divine and magnificent wedding he would celebrate with Harmonia. The unshakable walls of 7-gated Thebes, which rose over the fertile lands of Boeotia, were no longer merely a line of defense. They also shone as a monument to the unending perseverance of Cadmus, the exiled prince who had come from Phoenicia, and to his absolute devotion to divine will. Cadmus had embroidered into the mortar and stones of this new homeland the exhaustion of the years he had spent following the fading trace of his sister Europa, who had vanished among the foaming waves on the back of a white bull, and the burning sorrow of entrusting his mother Telephassa to the cold embrace of Thrace. He had single-handedly slain the terrifying dragon that guarded the sacred spring of Ares, and through the bloody yet unbreakable alliance he had forged with the Spartoi warriors, who had sprung from the teeth he had sown into the earth, he had built the citadel of Cadmeia. At last, as the price for the sacred blood that had been spilled, the heavy 8-year period of service and self-discipline he had offered to Ares, the god of war, had come to an end, and he had proven his maturity as a hero who had been purified and exalted in the eyes of the gods. He was no longer merely a homeless prince, but a legitimate and powerful king honored by the Olympian gods themselves. Yet before he placed the crown of this kingship upon his head, an extraordinary grace awaited him, the like of which the earth had never witnessed. As a reward for all the superhuman suffering Cadmus had endured, for his sacrifices in the search for Europa, and for his flawless service to Ares, mighty Zeus, the ruler of the heavens, had decided to offer him the most unique and most divine bride that could be given to a mortal man. This bride was Harmonia, the daughter of Ares, the savage and destructive power of war, and Aphrodite, the enchanting goddess of beauty, love, and desire, whose grace illuminated all the heavenly realms and the hearts of mortals alike. The union of Cadmus and Harmonia was not merely the marriage of two noble souls. It was also a sacred feast in which the gods descended to the earth and sat at the same table as mortals, where heaven and earth were joined as one. Although some traditions traced Harmonia's origin to the dark and mysterious Kabiri gods of the island of Samothrace, and to her being the daughter of Electra and Zeus, the people of Thebes and the poets had chosen to believe that she had been born from the immense and paradoxical union of war and love. When the wedding preparations began in the vast halls of the citadel of Cadmeia, Even the weight of the air had changed with divine splendor. The scents of myrrh, aloes wood, and saffron, brought from Phoenicia, had blended with the fragrances of amber and ambrosia drifting down from Olympus. This wedding had entered history as the first and most magnificent ceremony in which all the gods had temporarily left their golden thrones in the sky, descended to the earth, and mingled among mortals in the marble-columned halls of Cadmeia. Cadmus, remembering his sister Europa, who had once gathered flowers along the shores of Tyre and whose fate had changed the world, had greeted this new beginning offered to him by the gods with great reverence and tears. When the feast began, the 9 muses and the charites had begun to sing their most moving and most beautiful hymns for Cadmus and his incomparable bride Harmonia. As the soul-healing melodies poured forth from Apollo's golden lyre and echoed through the walls into the valley, the gifts that the gods had brought for this sacred bride formed the true, enchanting center of the ceremony. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had presented to Harmonia a magnificent peplos that she had woven with her own hands, upon which the hidden order of the universe and heroic tales had been embroidered with golden threads. Yet amid all this splendor, joy, and music, there was another gift, dazzling in its beauty, but harboring a dark destiny within. The famous necklace that would be remembered as the ominous gift. This necklace had been forged with great mastery by Hephaestus, the divine smith. According to some, it had been made at the direct request of Aphrodite, while according to others, it had passed from hand to hand as a keepsake that Zeus had given to Europa before reaching this wedding. With its golden links and rare stones that shone upon it and trapped the light of the sun, this jewel had been a work of art that would captivate every eye. Yet with every strike of Hephaestus's hammer, an invisible curse had seeped into it, destined to bring endless disasters upon its owner and her lineage. When Cadmus placed this gleaming necklace around Harmonia's swan-like slender neck, all the Olympians had blessed this union with great enthusiasm and applause. However, this ornament had stood like a silent and cold harbinger of the future tragedies of Thebes, of the dreadful and heart-wrenching ends that the daughters and grandchildren of Cadmus would experience. This divine marriage of Cadmus had given him the opportunity to teach the alphabet he had carried from Phoenicia to Greece and to establish culture there. While his children by Harmonia, Ino, Polydorus, Autonoi, Agave, and Semele, had filled the palace of Thebes with joy, the shadow of that ominous gift presented at the gods' magnificent wedding had secretly hovered over them at every moment. Semele's being reduced to ashes by the true majesty and lightning of Zeus, Actaeon's being brutally torn apart by his own dogs, and Ino's disappearance after leaping into the sea in a moment of madness had all been bitter echoes of this divine yet tragic beginning. As Cadmus watched, with aging and weary eyes, his family being drawn one by one into disasters, he had painfully understood that the price of killing the sacred dragon of Ares and touching the forbidden boundaries of the gods had not ended with merely 8 years of servitude, and that this debt would continue to be paid through bloodlines. Despite this, the wedding that had taken place that day in Cadmeia had been the moment when human and God had come closest to one another in history and had joined hands. When Cadmus sat upon his throne beside his divine wife Harmonia, he carried within his soul the Phoenician shores he had left behind, the abducted Europa, and the bloody war on the plains of Boeotia like medals of honor. Although the necklace around Harmonia's neck had promised an ominous future, the splendor of that moment, the abundance of the wine that had been poured, and this divine peace personally offered by the gods had sealed the foundations of Thebes with an unshakable and eternal epic. On that unique night when all the lights and blessings of Olympus had gathered upon the earth, Cadmos and Harmonia had initiated both the magnificent beginning of a kingdom and a shared destiny that would endure for centuries. As the gods returned to the sky after the feast, the gifts, the alphabet, and the blessings they had left behind had engraved the name of Cadmus into the deepest and most indelible memory of history, not merely as a founder of a city, but as a mortal hero who had been accepted into the very table and friendship of the gods. As the sun slowly set beyond the unshakable walls of glorious seven-gated Thebes, leaving behind the golden memories of Phoenicia and the heavy silence of a kingdom woven with blood, the time of farewell to these lands had finally arrived for the aged King Cadmus and Queen Harmonia. This legendary city, rising from the fertile heart of Boeotia, had once been built like a monument of hope upon the sacred spot where Apollo's holy cow had knelt. Yet the dark curse carried by the divine necklace and the spilled blood of Ares' sacred dragon had fallen upon the dynasty like an inescapable shadow. Although Cadmus had founded a new and magnificent homeland for himself, here after the futile years he had spent searching for his sister Europa, the horrific ends that befell his children one by one had filled his aging heart with irreparable sorrow and regret. The transformation of his daughter Semele into ashes by Zeus's divine lightning, the fate of his grandson Actaeon, who had fallen from hunter to prey and had been torn apart by his own dogs, and the murder of his own son Pentheus by his daughter Agave in a state of divine madness, had unleashed storms within Cadmus's soul that could never be calmed. Neither the seven gates of Thebes nor the marble columns of the palace whispered to him anymore of the old peaceful breezes of Phoenicia, for in every dim corner of the palace the cries of another tragedy echoed. Faced with these unbearable pains and the internal turmoil that gripped the city like a plague, Cadmus eventually decided to hand over the royal scepter to his grandson Pentheus and to set out with his life companion Harmonia toward an eternal and arduous exile. When they took their final steps beyond the walls of Thebes into the unknown, the bent shoulders of the elderly couple carried not only the weariness of years, but also the crushing weight of the gods' relentless and merciless wrath. The noble and proud blood they had brought from Phoenicia now flowed silently along foreign roads toward an uncertain and grey future. Their journey drove them northwest to the harsh, wild and wind-swept lands of the Adriatic coasts, to the homeland of the Enchelae. At that time, the Enchelean people had been crushed under the brutal attacks of their neighbors, the Illyrians, and they had awaited a divine savior to descend from the heavens so that they might survive. When sacred words spoken by a seer whispered that they could defeat the Illyrians if they chose Cadmus and Harmonia as their leaders, these two weary exiles found themselves once more at the very center of war and fate. Cadmus, donning with one final effort the ancient heroic spirit with which he had once slain the great dragon of Ares, took command of the army and, as the gods had promised, brought devastating destruction upon the Illyrian forces. After this magnificent victory, Cadmus ascended the throne as king of Illyria in these distant and savage lands. There he laid the foundations of cities such as Boeotia and Lychnidus, which would become new strongholds of civilization and new centers of reason. The borders of his kingdom now reached the raging seas, and from his sacred union with Harmonia, their final son was born, who would be remembered by the future name of these lands as Illyrius. Yet neither the bloody victories that had been won, nor the new cities built from nothing sufficed to dispel the dark thoughts that gnawed at Cadmus's mind like a rodent. One day, as he deeply pondered the origin of all the terrible disasters he had endured, the memory of the sacred serpent he had killed in Boeotia flashed through his mind like lightning, and with profound sorrow he cried out to the sky, "If that dragon was so precious to Ares, and if my entire lineage was being punished because of its sacred blood, then let the gods turn me too into a serpent." As the ancient poet Ovid had described with his trembling pen, no sooner had this desperate prayer fallen from his lips than Cadmus's body stiffened, his legs fused together, and his skin became covered with cold scales. As his skin turned jet black, deep blue speckles resembling the depths of the ocean spread across it. The once proud prince of Phoenicia had now transformed into a long, scaly and silent creature crawling upon its belly. With his aged and sorrowful eyes that still carried a human mind, Cadmus looked one last time at his wife Harmonia, as if in farewell. His tongue split in two and gave way to a dreadful metallic hiss. When Harmonia saw this horrific and heart-rending state of her husband, she was seized by great terror. Yet with her unshakable divine loyalty to him, she cried out and begged the gods, "Why did you not condemn me to the same fate as him as well? If he became a serpent, then I too should remain beside him as a serpent among his coils." The gods did not refuse the final wish of this noble and faithful woman. Soon Harmonia's delicate and graceful body was also covered with cold scales and lovingly entwined around her husband's scaly form. From then on, they glided through the deep, sunless forests of Illyria as two gentle serpents who never harmed humans and who never forgot their glorious past for even a moment. Yet the epic of Cadmus and Harmonia had been too sacred and too great to end upon the dusty soil of the earth as that of mere reptiles. Their silent transformation had in fact been the mysterious first step of a final purification and a passage into eternal peace offered by the gods. Great Zeus, seeing the indescribable suffering endured by this tragic hero of his own lineage and by Harmonia, the daughter of Ares, decided to free their souls from the heavy burden of the earth. Their spirits, slipping from their scaly bodies like a sheath, were carried by the gods themselves to the gardens of Elysium, the dwelling place of the immortals and the noblest heroes, to those sunlit plains of heaven that never withered. As Euripides had foretold in his prophecies, after wandering for a time in this world in the form of serpents, they finally took their deserved eternal place among the blessed. This magnificent life, which had begun as a shining star in Phoenicia, had evolved into a civilizational epic and the birth of the alphabet in Thebes, and had been concluded with a silent, mystical transformation in Illyria, ultimately reached eternal peace amid the cool breezes of Elysium and its soul-healing flowers. Although Cadmus had never found his sister Europa, through the unshakable cities he had founded, the alphabet he had bestowed upon humanity, and the endless, bittersweet fate he had shared with Harmonia, he had etched his name forever among the stars and upon the indelible golden pages of history. The story of Kadmos and Europa, which had begun on the Phoenician shores, had crossed the fierce waters of the Aegean and had turned into a monument of civilization on the fertile lands of Boeotia, was not merely an ancient tale confined to dusty parchments. This epic had continued to resonate, even after thousands of years, within the spiritual, social, and existential labyrinths of modern humanity. The great exile that had begun with Cadmus's departure from the palace of Tyre had in fact been an archaic prototype of the struggle each of us had faced in our life journey to find oneself and to search for what was lost. Those fundamental human realities that had been forgotten amid the noise of technological devices, belonging, betrayal, atonement, and the transmission of knowledge, had still waited to sprout like fresh seeds in the field where Cadmus had sown the dragon's teeth. Europa's abduction by Zeus had not been merely the result of a divine whim. It had also been a symbol of how humanity's purest ideals and untouched beauties had been taken away by external, sometimes uncontrollable forces. In the modern world, Europa had represented our innocence, our untainted desires, and our childlike joy. Zeus, on the other hand, had often appeared as necessities, passions, or social expectations that confronted us in the guise of life's imposing yet deceptive white bull. Just as Europa had been carried away by a miracle while gathering flowers, modern humanity had sometimes drifted away from its own safe palace, that is, inner peace, by following a dazzling promise. The new life that had begun with Europa's arrival in Crete had whispered that every loss had in fact marked the birth of a new continent and a new civilization. Everything we had lost today had actually been the journey on the back of that sacred bull that had carried us toward another shore and another identity. The desperate years Cadmus had spent searching for Europa had directly overlapped with the modern individual's search for meaning. His father Agenor's command to not return without finding her had been an ancient reflection of the pressure modern society had placed upon us to not stop without succeeding, or to not settle without finding perfection. As Cadmus had wandered the world from one end to the other, he had in fact searched for something he could not have found outside himself. The death of his mother, Telephassa, on the lands of Thrace had represented the heaviest price of the quest, the severing of the final bond with the past. Modern humanity, like Cadmus, had sacrificed many values along the way while searching for something lost. Yet the advice given to Cadmus by the Delphic oracle to stop searching had formed the most crucial point of this epilogue. Sometimes, in order to find, one had needed to stop searching, to surrender, and to follow the brindled cow, that is, the natural flow of life. Cadmus's decision to abandon the pursuit of a dream and to focus on building a tangible future, a city, had reminded modern humanity that the time had come to make peace with what was and to construct what should be with one's own hands. Cadmus's greatest achievement in the myth had not been merely killing a dragon, but altering the course of knowledge and history by bringing the Phoenician alphabet to Greece. As Herodotus had noted, these Cadmean letters had been one of the most important bridges in humanity's transition from oral tradition to written civilization. In the modern age, this legacy had not consisted solely of graphic symbols. It had become the very building blocks of thought. By introducing writing, Cadmus had transformed chaos into order. Spoken words had faded, but writing, like the walls of Thebes, had endured. In the modern world, we too had created our own alphabet every day. Every sentence we had formed and every legacy of thought we had left had become a stone added to Cadmus's seven-gated city. Knowledge had been the only true weapon capable of calming the savagery of the dragon. Cadmus's slaying of Ares' dragon and the eruption of warriors from the teeth he had sown into the earth had symbolized the inevitable violence and conflict at the birth of civilization. The Spartoi, the sown men, had in fact represented the angers, ambitions, and social conflicts we had planted with our own hands. Their mutual slaughter had revealed the tragic fate of masses unable to unite around a common purpose. In modern society, we had still sown dragon's teeth. While absolutizing our own truths and attacking others, we had forgotten that we had come from the same soil and the same root. Cadmus's act of throwing stones among them to turn them against one another had embodied the wisdom of sometimes allowing conflict to exhaust itself. The five survivors, Echion, Udaios, Chthonios, Hyperenor, and Peloros, had proven that a city could rise only when peace had been made. Thebes, that is, civilization, had risen upon the shoulders of this sacred five upon reconciliation. The 8 years of servitude that had followed Cadmus's victory had conveyed that no achievement had been without cost, and that every great founder had first needed to serve either their own self-discipline or a divine will. For those of us captivated by tales of instant success in the modern world, Cadmus's patient endurance had emphasized the importance of the suffering required for the maturation of character. At the end of the story, the transformation of Cadmus and Harmonia into serpents in Illyria had not been a tragic ending, but a return to nature and to essence. To shed one's skin had meant to be freed from the burdens of the past and to attain eternal peace, Elysium. As dragons or serpents, they had become nothing more than the guardians of their own past. The journey that had begun on the shores of Tyre and had concluded in the gardens of Elysium had been the journey of modern humanity. Even today, we had continued to search for our Europa, that is, our lost innocence. We had continued to fight the dragons within us and to strive so that the teeth we had sown would not destroy us. Yet we had possessed Cadmus's greatest legacy, the alphabet, that is, communication, that is, meaning, that is, recorded human dignity. The walls of Thebes might have been ruined today, but the seed of civilization that Cadmus had sown had continued to live in the words of each of us. This epilogue had been for those who had read the divine games of the past with modern wisdom. We should have remembered that each of us had been the Cadmus of our own life. We had followed our own cow, killed our own dragon, and ultimately sought peace in the Illyria of our own soul. The silent gliding of Cadmus and Harmonia had whispered to us that where ambition had ended, harmony had begun.